Alien Queen furious when human warrior returns her enchanted sword. The ground thought. Tomek Varus had been in enough alien environments to stop trusting his first impressions of them, but this one earned a second look anyway. The soil along the perimeter path was faintly luminescent, not the dead, manufactured glow of biolights or hull phosphors, but something slower and more considered. Threads of pale violet light pulsed beneath the surface in branching patterns, dimming here, brightening there. The rhythm offset from his footsteps in a way that made it clear the pulsing was not caused by his footsteps. It was already in conversation with something. He was walking through the margin of a sentence he didn't have the alphabet for. He kept his hands away from his sides, palms visible. His escort 3 Varath workers, each the height of his sternum, each carrying the particular stillness that he had learned in the 14-hour briefing to read as active attention, moved in a loose triangle around him. Their carapaces shifted color in slow waves, amber bleeding into copper bleeding into a deep arterial red that cycled back before it fully arrived. He had been told this was ambient speech, background chatter between bodies. He had been told not to try to read it. He tried not to read it. The sealed case on his back weighed less than it should have for something this classified. He'd been handed it on the landing pad by a Accord officer who hadn't made eye contact and said only, "Return this. Don't open it en route. Don't discuss it on any monitored frequency." Then she'd walked away at a pace that could generously be called professional and less generously called fleeing. Tomek had opened it in the shuttle. Of course he had. It was a blade. Long, slightly curved, crystalline in a way that suggested the crystal was structural rather than decorative, no facets for catching light. Just a kind of deep translucency that held the eye longer than glass had any right to. It hummed at the lower edge of his hearing, not a sound so much as a presence. The way a large animal in an adjacent room makes itself known before you've consciously registered the breathing. He'd closed the case, held very still for a moment, then flown the remaining 40 minutes in silence, which was not his habit. Now the hive rose ahead of him. It did not look like a structure. It looked like the landscape had developed an opinion. The growth, resin chitin, something between the two that the briefing notes called excrete composite with the confidence of people who were also guessing, rose in irregular towers that leaned toward each other without touching, connected by spans of the same material that had the profile of buttresses, but the texture of something that had grown that way rather than been placed. The whole thing was warm. He could feel it from 20 meters, not unpleasant, the warmth of a body, not a furnace. The mycelial threads in the soil grew denser as he approached. The violet light intensified, dimmed, shifted into a blue-white that moved in the direction he was walking, ahead of him, pointing. He thought, the path is being made as I walk it. He thought, or it was always there, and it's just now being shown to me. He thought, those are meaningfully different things, and I don't know which one is true. The workers led him through an entrance that wasn't an arch so much as a pause in the wall, a gap that had been left, grown around on 3 sides, like a word with space deliberately given to silence. Inside, the air changed, warmer, heavier with something that wasn't quite scent and wasn't quite pressure. His sinuses registered it as significance. His training registered it as pheromone gradient. The two descriptions did not feel equivalent. In a chamber 50 meters in, his escort stopped. He stopped. They performed no gesture he could parse as instruction. They simply ceased moving, and in the cessation was a very clear communication that he should do the same. He had learned this too. Negative space was vocabulary in here. He stood and breathed and let the hive take his measure. In the outer membrane of the worker cluster, 4 of them now, a 5th having joined in the transition between chambers, there was a category problem occurring that no prior taxonomy had adequately prepared them for. The warm moving creature with its bilateral symmetry and its single pair of ocular receivers and its extraordinary chemical blankness was carrying the lost frequency. This was known. The Accord signal had transmitted this ahead of its arrival. The workers had been prepared for the encounter in the sense of having been told it would occur, which was not the same as being prepared. The lost frequency, the Velkrath, in the resonance language that had no direct phonemic equivalent, had been absent from the hive's awareness for 11 tidal cycles. Its absence was not silence. Absence of the Velkrath was its own frequency, a kind of permanent negative chord that the Queen's distributed cognition had been sustaining across the hive's network, a drawn-out wound held carefully open to prevent it from scarring wrong. And now it was back. And it was being carried by a creature with no chromatophoric language, which meant no language, which meant what? In the Varath categorical system, a being without color speech was not precisely a being. It was matter that moved with intentions. The intentions were, under current evidence, indeterminate. The workers' carapaces held steady at a deep amber. The warm-moving creature stood very still. Its stillness read, in Varath grammar, as a very loud statement. They waited for the Queen to receive them. The Queen's chamber was the hive's largest enclosed space, which did not mean what it would mean in a human building. It was large the way a lung is large, functional expansion, sized to the process it contained, not to any aesthetic of grandeur. The ceiling was also a floor. A second tier of Varath clung to the upper surface of the chamber, their orientation inverted relative to Tomic's gravity, and they watched him with the patient attention of creatures for whom downward and upward were suggestions rather than laws. The walls breathed. He had been expecting metaphor. It was literal. The excrete composite panels expanded and contracted in a slow rhythm, 8 seconds out, 6 seconds in, slightly irregular in the way that biological rhythms are always slightly irregular. The chromatophore patterns across every surface ran in continuous cascade, and even without being able to read them, he could feel their urgency the way you feel weather before the rain arrives. The Queen was at the center. She was larger than her workers by a factor that felt wrong until he remembered that she was not simply larger but differently. Her 6 limbs were arranged differently. The 2 manipulator arms held at a height and angle that suggested display rather than use. The carapace, a deep, shifting iridescence that moved too fast and too intricately to be ambient speech. She was broadcasting. She had been broadcasting before he entered, and she would continue broadcasting after he left, and everything in the room was receiving. His translator, a field unit, short range, calibrated on 6 tidal cycles of intercepted Varath signal, sat in his left ear and was currently producing the soft triple click that meant it was processing, but had not yet found a lexical match. He crossed the chamber. He set the case on the composite floor in front of her. He opened it. The Velkrath lay in its seal foam cradling, the crystal clear and the hum, now audible to him in this space, resonating with the chamber's own frequency, rising from something he felt in his molars to something he felt in his chest. The Queen went absolutely still. The workers along the walls went absolutely still. The tier above him went absolutely still. Then her carapace ignited. There was no other word for it. The color shift was not a cascade but a simultaneous activation across her entire surface, a deep, saturated red-violet that pulsed in a pattern so fast the individual beats blurred into a sustained chord. His translator clicked again, and then, with the slightly flattened quality of something approximated rather than translated, it produced. You have brought the wound back. A pause, the pattern shifted. His translator worked. Why did you not destroy it? Not a question. The grammar of it, or what passed for grammar in the translation field's best attempt, was imperative, accusatory. The kind of sentence that comes after a long time of assuming the answer was already agreed upon. Tomic stood very still. He said, I was given this object and told to return it. I was told it belonged to you. His translator converted his words into an approximation of Varath signal. He could see the field unit's transmitter pulsing at his collarbone, a pale blue that was the machine's best effort at neutral. He had been told not to expect much from the conversion. The grammar was too different. The best he could hope for was that she received the shape of his intent. She received something. Her response came faster this time. His translator took longer. The object's return is not a gift, it is a history. You have returned a history into this room where it cannot be made to have not happened. He said, I don't understand. Her carapace dimmed, not the dimming of someone who had stopped speaking, the dimming of someone who had decided he was not worth the frequency. That he understood fine. The workers closed around him. The room they grew him was not a cell. He knew a cell. He had spent 11 hours in a keth holding space on Meridian Station, which had been specifically designed with human containment in mind, and which had all the features you'd expect. Sealable entrance, minimal interior, environmental controls set just uncomfortable enough to make the point. That had been a cell. This was a chamber roughly 4 meters across, the walls composed of the same excrete composite as the rest of the hive, but newly extruded. He could see the material still settling, the surface tension resolving from something almost liquid to something almost solid over the 20 minutes he sat watching it. The composite had been shaped around 2 existing pillars that were clearly load-bearing elements of the larger structure, which meant they had not grown this room around him from nothing. They had grown it around him, using what was already there. They had made him a room, not a cage, a room. The floor had a slight texture variation in the center that was, he was fairly certain, meant to be comfortable to sit on. He sat on it. The temperature adjusted, not dramatically, 2 degrees, maybe 3, the kind of adjustment a considerate host makes. He listened to the hive. It was everywhere. In the vibration of the composite walls, in the pheromone gradient that he was beginning to distinguish into layers, some chemical, some pressure, some a combination he didn't have sensory apparatus to properly process. It was not quiet. It was loud in frequencies he could only partially hear, in a language he could only partially track, in a grammar he could not parse at all. Being inside, it was like being inside a conversation that had been going on for 11 tidal cycles, and would continue for 11 more, and was not waiting for his input. He thought about what the Queen had said. The object's return is a history. He turned the phrase over. He was not a linguist. His field designation was relic handler, which was a deliberately vague title that the Accord used for people who were adaptable and not too attached to specific protocols. He had handled a lot of things. He had returned things before. He had never had a return generate that particular response. You have returned a history into this room, where it cannot be made to have not happened. He thought, the object has a past that its return reactivates. He thought returning it didn't undo something, it did something. He took the case from where a worker had left it in the corner. He hadn't been searched, which was either a statement of respect or a statement that they considered him too limited to be a threat, and he opened it. The Velcrath lay in its seal foam, humming its not-quite sound. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he picked it up. Not by any deliberate plan. He was not performing bravado, and he was not following any protocol he had been given, because no protocol covered this, and his briefing had been 9 hours shorter than it should have been. He picked it up because he had been handed a problem he didn't understand, and his particular response to problems he didn't understand was to put his hands on them and pay attention. The Velcrath was lighter than the crystal suggested. The hum changed when he held it, not louder, but differently located, as if the source had shifted from somewhere in the room to somewhere in his hands. He held it flat across both palms, the way you'd hold something you were examining rather than something you were wielding, and he waited to see what it would do. What it did was go quiet. Not silent, but the hum that had been running at the lower edge of his auditory range since he'd opened the case on the shuttle, that particular frequency, The one his molars had been registering as presence settled, softened. The crystal's internal quality changed. He couldn't name it more precisely than that. It was like watching a person stop bracing. He turned it slowly in his hands. He thought, this is not a weapon. He thought it was never a weapon. He held it and breathed and did not try to make it do anything. Because that was the other thing he had learned in 14 years of relic work. The things that responded to patience responded badly to demand. You had to give them time to take your measure the same way you were taking theirs. In the network of the hive, in the distributed awareness that was the Queen's consciousness spread thin and warm through 11,000 individual bodies, and the composite walls between them, something shifted. The Velcrath was not producing signal. It was never not producing signal. Even in the 11 tidal cycles of its absence, the hive had felt its negative frequency, had organized itself around the missing note the way a river organizes around an absent stone, the water remembering the shape long after the stone is gone. When the warm-moving creature had brought it into the chamber, the Queen had felt the wound reopen, not pain, but the return of a sensation she had learned to manage without. But the Velcrath was not producing signal. Or rather, it was producing something, but not Verath's signal. It was producing the frequency of a channel held open with nothing speaking into it, the frequency of readiness, of waiting. It was reading the warm-moving creature the way it would read the space between words. The Queen, processing this across 11,000 nodes, reached for a categorization and found none. The closest thing she had was a concept that translated imperfectly to unexpected ground. The sensation of putting weight on something and finding it solid when you had expected yielding. Not safety, not threat, something prior to both. She extended her awareness toward the room they had grown for him. She felt the Velcrath settle in his hands. She had not expected that. In 47 years of holding the hive's distributed consciousness, the Queen had felt the Velcrath respond to three things: her own touch, her daughter's touch, and the touch of the dissidents who had aligned with her daughter during the 11 tidal cycles of internal fracture that she did not ever call by the word that meant civil war. She had not expected it to settle for anything that wasn't Verath. She extended her awareness further. The warm-moving creature sat cross-legged on the floor. She knew this body configuration from Accord records, knew it was associated in human postural vocabulary with something between contemplation and submission, and held the Velcrath across both open palms and breathed. The Queen had no category for what she was watching. She held that absence of category with the precision she brought to every problem the hive had never encountered. She paid attention.